Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. We're here with royal commentator Patricia Treble, and we have both been writing things in the last week about the role that the King of Canada can and possibly should be playing in this particular moment in time when our sovereignty is coming under threat. So I figured we'd have a little more of a chat about it, being as we've both written these pieces. Patricia, why don't we start with your piece and talking about the next royal tour in Canada, which probably won't be till 2026 at the at the pace things are going. But you had some particular suggestions about the things the government needs to do as part of the programming. Why don't we start there?
So let's start about the royal tour. So this is all coming out of Russ Myers of the Daily Mirror, who is very, very plugged into the King's office at Buckingham Palace, especially when it comes to foreign tours. He's been bang on with all announcing them well ahead of almost everyone else. And he came out and he said that there's going to be a tour of the Americas, which is Canada, and then the United States. And I actually asked him very specifically just to make sure. And he said, yes, the concept is that you go to Canada first and then to the United States. Obviously, it is incredibly important.
And just to interrupt there, I did confirm with my own sources that no tour would happen in the US without a tour in Canada first.
Exactly. And no tour has ever happened in the States without a tour in Canada first. So if you're doing two, you always do Canada first. So, and starting with the very first, 1939, the King and Queen were here just before the war. They went from coast to coast, then went down to visit Franklin Roosevelt in Washington. That is always the way, because he is, of course, our monarch. He is the King of Canada. He is not the visiting British monarch. And what really came about is, let's face it, we are facing an existential threat from the United States. I do not think that is going away. It will still be prevalent next year. Next year, of course, is the 250th anniversary of the United States in independence from Britain.
Yes.
So it's going to be a lot of hot button issues, especially with President Trump. And the big thing for me is that what a lot of Americans, and what I think President Trump doesn't realize, is that King Charles, whom he has a very good relationship with, even though they're completely different on so many fronts, they're not lined up on Ukraine, they're not lined up on the environment, they're not lined up on climate change, but they get along really well. I mean, let's face it, the royals are really good diplomats, soft power. Trump really likes being seen with royalty because it's the one thing you can't buy your way into, right?
Right.
And he wants the king in the United States for the 250th anniversary celebrations. At the same time, I don't think he has any clue that the king is also the King of Canada. And I think this is a time when we're going to have to demand that the King of Canada is going to have to show up, and he's going to have to, as I said, prove he is the King of Canada. He is going to have to be forceful in his defense of Canada, of the country, and make it clear that he sides with Canada. And I think a state visit, this is the sort of thing that would be perfect timing, I think, coming just before the US visit. It's going to be tricky, though, because let's face it, you've got the British, who, of course, have their own agenda for what they want the monarch to do, what they want soft power to do. But I think that for Canada, anything less than a full-throated defense of Canada will simply just not be tolerated by the public.
Yeah. Yeah, and this kind of leads to some of what I was discussing in my own piece, was that the way in which the king would have to do this is a much more subtle way, and not a statement or any kind of loud diplomatic statement, but rather it needs to be much more subdued and underplayed in terms of using his authority as king to recognize a lot of Canadian things, a lot of Canadian achievements, a lot of Canadian people, and do it in that particular way rather than make any bold declarations. Because as I go into the piece, the first rule of constitutional monarchy is you don't drag the king into your fights.
No. Yeah. And you really don't want him to get involved when right now it is a political issue, right?
Yeah.
I mean, right now it's the prime minister, it's the premiers. They're the one fighting the battles. You do not, save him. He is the reserve. He's kind of the guy who goes in at the very end and just kind of pushes everything across the finish line, as it were. We saw a bit of it already.
The nuclear option, but it's like the next best thing to the nuclear option.
Exactly. It really is soft power. And look, he is very good at making these sorts of speeches. He's been doing them his whole life. He is really good at being diplomatic. He's got very good speech writers. And I would presume Canada, of course, would be absolutely involved, because every indication
100%.
from the Canadian head of state has to be approved by the Canadian government.
Yeah.
And he knows where the lines are. I think this is going to be a major test, though. I mean, I really do. And what did you think, by the way, of the Flag Day note that he put out, which I think was actually quite interesting, given that the branding that is normally blue from Buckingham Palace went all perfectly Canadian red and white on that day?
Well, that was kind of what brought this whole thing on, for at least for me, was because when I started sharing this over social media, I got so much of a deluge of response in terms of, why isn't the king saying anything? Why isn't he standing up to Trump? Why isn't he, doing anything? And I had to keep telling people, he's not doing it because the prime minister hasn't asked him to. Kings do not, or constitutional monarchs do not act unilaterally. They haven't since, is it 1688 is I think the Glorious Revolution?
Yep.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, he has,
and for those of you,
the previous King Charles, which brought that whole crisis on. So this is the thing I had to keep explaining to people, was that he can't come out and do this. And it's not a thing that, I had so much like, oh, he doesn't care. It's like, no, look, he just can't. Like, he does not have the unilateral authority to do that. No. And it's one of these things with, Canadian civics, that we just don't teach this stuff to people. And it's up to people like you and I who have to spread this message that, this is how constitutional monarchy works.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's what I think is going to be so important about this tour. Because as I said in my piece, it's free for anyone, Substack. And
I'm going to put the link for that below in the description as well.
But I said this tour is going to be extremely important, and they're going to have to go all out. It is not going to, there can be no worthy Canadian initiatives, boring, in this whatsoever. This has to be pomp, it has to be circumstance, it has to be perfection. It has to be choreographed to the nth degree, because you're playing really to an audience of one in the White House. And this has to be the King of Canada celebrating the glories of Canada, of an independent monarchy.
Yeah.
And so you need everything perfect. I want to see the musical ride from the RCMP. I want the military drilled to an inch of its life. Everything has to be absolutely perfect. Every vantage point for the media has to be absolutely perfect. And we have not had that recently. I was on the last tour, which was the 3-day, 2,000 kilometer, fatigue fest, I'm going to call it. Yeah. I was in Ottawa, and it was not well done. Most of the main heritage people who would normally be in charge of this had retired over the pandemic, and those who were in place were very junior, were very inexperienced. It really showed. At one point, the media, basically, we were on a bus together, and we kind of took over. because we realized that the heritage person just didn't quite have the authority to move us from A to B where we needed to be. And we went exactly where we were supposed to be, just so people know. Like we weren't like, creating a coup, but we needed to go somewhere very specifically. And normally that would be no problem. And you could get your feed and you could uplink your video. And it was not well organized. And the press was really, really grumbling about it because they were missing their feed windows. And when you miss your feed windows, what that means for everyone, people kind of like, oh, yeah, whatever, you're grumbling. But it means that you don't get the visuals out in time to go on the national show back in Britain, in Australia, in all around the world. This is what you want. You want to project this is what you want to do. You want to project Canada on the world stage. This is how you do it. And so when you mess up those basic fundamentals, it really shows that cannot happen this time. And this tour is going to have to be longer than the American tour. It has to be. This is not a 3-day, 2,000-kilometer fest. You are going to have to spend some serious time here. And I'm going to say you know what I would really like, Dale? I would like him to open Parliament.
Yeah, and that's going to be a question of timing. I mean, depending on when it happens. I mean, we'll be past the election by then, but the thing is that we've developed this allergy to prorogation in Canada, and that's what it would require, and that's so it's got to be whoever the next prime minister is going to have to really like swallow hard and work their own particular parliamentary scheduling around this tour in such way that yes, we can have the king do a speech from the throne in that kind of regard. So
and I'm going to say Queen Camilla, pack some tiaras, pack some long gowns, pack your coronation gown. So like the late Queen, when she first came to Canada after her coronation in 1957, and she was really here for a few days. It was really just to do a state opening of Parliament. She wore her coronation gown. And I think you need full pomp and full circumstance. Call in every chit. If you want to have a big concert, let the kids have the day off school, so there are huge cheering crowds. And this is the fun stuff, because if you've ever seen the King and Queen on tour, they thrive on interactions with people in crowds. I mean, they like nothing more than a farmer's market or chatting with little kids, going into a pub, pulling a pint and sitting down and talking to people. And that's where they can shine in a way that, of course, the president of the United States can't do that because of security concerns. And so you can really show the interactions between Canadians and their monarch. I think it's going to be an incredibly important, maybe the most important royal visit there has ever been.
Quite possibly. And I think that's probably going to have to include something in the Arctic, because that's another one of those kind of key trigger points for Trump. So again, it's going to be depending on what time of year, because that creates its own logistical challenges. But yeah, I think that's something that's probably going to have to be a part of that tour whenever we start getting down to the logistics of what it's going to all entail.
And what do you think about like normally you go to provinces who invite, but I think all the normal rules regarding a royal tour, I think they're going to be out the window for this one, don't you?
Hard to say. I think you might have provinces who are going to be fighting for as opposed to just kind of being blasé about it, because the import of it will be magnified by the time it does wind up happening. So I think it may in fact be where you're going to have to kind of pick and choose in such a way that we can try and hit as many major, I guess, milestones. That's not quite the right word.
The most important
touch
areas.
points, that what I'm trying to say here. But to try and get as many of those within I'm going to guess 5 or 6 days. Because that's, I think, generally how long those tend to, or those kinds of tours tend to be. Um, with the half or one, or it's either a half day or a full day off in the middle of it. I read all of this logistic stuff before,
Yeah.
but yeah, the way in which they have to schedule it, I think it's going to have to try and as much of Canada as possible
Yeah.
within those few days, in order to yeah, give the this is the King of Canada. This is his, I guess, this is his country. This is
Yeah,
these are
exactly. And
these are his people, and to really just kind of make that the thrust of this.
yeah, and I think there's always the whither Quebec question. Do they go to Quebec? And normally I would say, given with Legault in power, I would say maybe not. But I think that has all changed with this. I mean, and I especially think maybe going to Montreal, looking at all the environmental changes that have been done in Montreal and how successful they are, and they've attracted all new businesses and all this sort of stuff. That is very much his bailiwick,
Yeah,
and I think the province would want to promote that. And of course, he speaks absolutely fluent, perfect French.
yeah,
But also, it's the reason I think it's also changed is not only it's Trump, but it's the reaction to everything. It's what's going to happen, obviously, with the tariffs. I mean, it's a free floating situation. This is gonna change a few times, but I was struck by when the Canadian national anthem was played in Montreal at the Four Nations. And
yeah,
the first thing that hit me was I have never seen so many electronic versions of the Maple Leaf flag as I have in that stadium at the playing of that. And the fact that everyone was singing at the top of their lungs.
yeah.
They started with the French, they switched to the English at the end, the way everyone does. And it was amazing. I mean, it was really emotional. So when I look at that, I think, yeah, things really have changed in this country. It's going to be interesting in a year.
Mhm.
I think it's probably going to be a spring visit, because of course I would imagine Trump would want him in the lead up
Yeah.
to. There is a term for the 250th, and I cannot get it in my brain, so
I
I
don't
am not
remember it
going there.
offhand,
It is the
but
sesquidecicent, whatever.
yeah.
It is something. So I would think
Well, the other
May.
thing too is, I was just reading on the weekend that the Parti Québécois had been in ascendance, and their poll numbers have just tanked in light of Trump and the attacks on Canadian sovereignty.
Yeah.
So you might be onto something there, that they might be more receptive to a royal tour, or even a scaled down version of it,
Yeah.
for an afternoon in Montreal, or to something, some effect like that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the one thing to always kind of keep in mind is that Queen Camilla is not a big flyer. I mean, she does it. She's not fond of it.
Okay.
So I would hope for, I gotta be honest, I'm gonna go for the moon. I'm gonna say 10 days. Because this is the first big trip. When they were in Australia, right ahead of CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in
Yeah.
Samoa, they were there, I think, for 5 or 6 days. Now they had some days off, and I think
Yeah.
perfect, have some days off. Enjoy the countryside. But I think you have to come here for a chunk of time.
Yeah.
I think it's just so important. It's so critical right
Particularly
now.
as the senior realm, as we are known as.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are the senior realm. We are the northern realm. And to be honest, I mean, everything has changed since January 20th. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just had one other question I wanted to just quickly put past you, before we wrap up here.
Yeah.
I was thinking the other day that in a lot of media before the coronation, there was the second season of House of Cards in the, I want to say, early 90s. There was that Charles III play. Both of them had described a Charles reign that was very brief because he was going to be too activist to want to maintain the kind of detachment of the crown. We're a couple of years now into his reign.
Yeah.
There's been none of that. I just wanted to
Yeah.
get your brain a little bit on what you think.
Yeah.
How he's surprised all these expectations.
I mean, I'm going to be honest. I wasn't surprised because he had always said he knows the difference between being Prince of Wales, when you can have a lot of opinions, and being
Yeah,
monarch, when you have to be politically neutral. But I think it surprised a lot of people because he really took to the role. He jumped in with both feet, the way he always does. I mean, the man
yeah,
works a lot. I mean, his relaxation is work,
yeah.
and he really
Going for those
has.
red boxes.
Yeah, going, oh my goodness, he does. Or going for incredibly long hikes, picking mushrooms in Balmoral. But he genuinely really enjoys the job, because also he's been around for so long that he's met so many people, he's built up so many relationships, and they know he's an environmentalist. They
Yeah.
know what his interests are, and so they tailor their visits to that. So I'm really looking forward to Italy.
Hmm.
Vatican might be a little interesting, which is coming up in April. But I'm looking for that because they're gonna absolutely tailor to him, and he is the ultimate constitutional monarch. It's different from how the Queen has been doing things. He is doing things, he is definitely doing things differently.
Yeah.
But he is absolutely following the path that he has to follow as a constitutional monarch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to have this conversation, and we'll chat in the very near future.
Oh man, there's no question about this. This is going to be occupying a lot of our time, isn't it, Dale?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Cheers.
Bye bye.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.